So my name is Jeff Beatty. I'm a localization engineer at Mozilla. Mozilla being the nonprofit open source project that puts users first and develops such popular applications as Firefox and Firefox for Android and now Firefox OS. One of the great things about Mozilla is that we actually have a ton of open source projects. We don't just do Firefox. And a lot of the projects, while we don't intend for the public to not be aware of them, it just so happens that few people are aware that we do more than just Firefox. I'm very passionate about languages. Part of the reason why I work at Mozilla is because I believe that people should have access to the web and to content on the web in their language. How you doing?
Good. Localization?
Absolutely. And that's really what, that's part of the core values of Mozilla. We believe in accessibility of information. And so really the only limitation on our ability to provide that to the world is the number of participants involved in helping to localize Mozilla products and projects. The stuff that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to talk about 3 particular projects. And in fact, I've already kind of talked a little bit about some of my opening slides, so we'll just kind of skip through those a little bit. Of course, you all know who we are. We put the power of the web in people's hands. We're a global community. We have a particular vision for what we'd like to see open source localization being in the world. We want to cause a linguistic power shift. We want, just as the previous slide mentioned, we want to put the power of the web in people's hands. So we want to also put the power of individuals' languages in their own hands and allow them to make the web what they actually need it to be. We want to improve freedom of expression. And we also want to improve localizability for the web and increase web literacy and accessibility through language. So we have several open source tool projects that we're working on for localization. We have the first being L20N, which is more of a back-end tool, and we'll talk a little bit about that first. We have Pontoon, which is a front-end tool, and Intellego, which is an open machine translation platform that actually is fairly newborn. So I won't have much to show you on Intellego's front, unfortunately. So let's start with L20N. If you're familiar with localization, I assume you're also familiar with the acronym L10N, correct? The 10 being the number of characters in between the L and the N, all of that. So we're trying to hint at second generation L10N when we use the term L20N. Traditionally, and I wish that there were some markers because I wasn't able to I didn't have time to draw this before. Traditionally, with localization, when it comes to a program's like actual logic for processing the strings within an application, you have the bulk of your source code, let's just say within one circle, correct? And then you have, if it's a properly internationalized application, you'll have resource files containing strings in different languages, correct? Most of them will include entity IDs so that you can actually reference back to them in the code, and the code does the bulk of the processing, correct? Everything in those resource files is completely and totally static. With L20N, it changes that a bit. The problem that we see with that is that we tend to entrust, there tends to be a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of potentially monolingual developers who don't really know how Tamil is supposed to be processed or how Kosa from South Africa is supposed to actually appear. They may understand encoding systems and character sets, which is great, but they don't understand the grammar. They don't understand male and female. They don't understand declensions, and that causes a lot of problems in applications. So what L20N is a brand new framework that actually transfers some of that processing logic from the core coding base into these resource files. These resource files are in a .L20N file format, L20N, you actually use a declarative JavaScript-based programming language in order to define your L20N code. And it contains bindings to other programming languages like HTML and Python, JavaScript, PHP, and they're working on Java right now in order to be able to provide full implementation into the Android framework. So this is kind of what it looks like. Now, a lot of these examples were written up by my coworker named Stash Madalepsi. He and I have traveled around a lot talking about L20N and Pontoon in particular. So a lot of these examples are going to involve Polish. You'll see that we can actually identify attributes to an entity that are directly related to grammatical principles. And so in Polish, for example, typically in localization, you don't translate a brand name because there are a lot of business and trademark issues and copyright issues with that. But in some languages like Polish, if you don't declare a state of being through grammar, then it can actually have really negative consequences. So for example, how many of you speak a second language? Yeah? How many, does your second language contain gender? No? So some words have male and female in certain languages. Well, in Polish, there's male, female, and living or dead. And so if they don't use this form, the locative, this grammatical case, to indicate state of being or living or dead, then there's the possibility for a mistranslation and a gross misrepresentation of what the brand actually is. So with having static strings, it's nearly impossible to be able to change that translation or even to provide multiple options for the program to actually logically provide the most appropriate translation. So through L20N and attributes and things, we're able to actually do that. Yes?
So this is what it looks like in the L20N file? Or
Exactly.
This is what it looks like in the HTML markup?
In the L20N file. Mm-hmm. The HTML markup simply identifies the entity name, the entity ID. So the HTML markup doesn't have to do any sort of processing for the language itself. All that processing takes place within the L20N files, and they are all isolated. So in other words, what's contained, any macro, any scripting that's contained within the Polish file will not bleed over into the Chinese file or into the Spanish file. That's another challenge with localization. Anything that you put in that central code is going to have to account for processing all languages that pass through the application. So we want to be able to break that up and allow people to actually determine how their language would be processed. So we try to codify the logic of the language, and in doing so we can unleash its expressive power, because now instead of a monolingual developer determining and having that whole burden on their shoulders to determine how every language will be processed in their application, it's now up to those people who are expert in their language to actually determine that and actually provide full expressiveness. We don't force the developer to think too much, and that usually makes a much easier process. If I could give you a story, I was a freelance translator for a really long time, and I would get jobs to translate from English to Spanish from a software company up in Oregon. And they'd send me YAML files, and I would go about translating them. The YAML files are really, really static, just like any other resource file, right? And so whenever I would see a string like user is married, that became a really big challenge for me because, well, do I say casado or casada? Do I assign male or feminine to this adjective? I have no idea because both genders are going to be passing through that user variable. And so I would often come up with a translation like casado/a, which is horrible. And so had L20N been around at the time, it would have been much simpler for me to be able to actually provide two translations and declare one as masculine and one as feminine in order to be able to logically process that and provide the right translation according to the gender of the user. So L20N is grammar agnostic. We attempt to cover a full range of linguistic grammatical issues that you might find. It's object-oriented, and it contains a very simple API. It's also been presented as part of the ECMA TC39 group, the ECMA internationalization standard for JavaScript.
Sorry, back that up a little bit.
Yeah.
You say when it's been presented, meaning it's been presented to ECMA, or ECMA has approved it and has presented it as a standard?
So it's currently part of the actual specification for ECMA, and it's currently under review. Mm-hmm. The two main developers for L20N are Polish. There's Stash that I mentioned before, and then there's Zbigniew. And Zbigniew is actually a member of this TC39 group. So we've been collaborating very closely with ECMA in order to standardize this language. So let's go into a few examples. Here's essentially what you would see in HTML. Here's what you would see in L20N. We don't want developers to try to think too much, and we also don't want to make this far too complicated for localizers. Localizers are familiar with the whole ID value paradigm, and we don't want to shake that up too much for them, because we understand that we'd be asking them a lot to learn how to do the coding that would be required in this. We also don't want to ask developers too much, which is why it's very simple like this. You define an L10N ID and assign it that ID that's in the actual L20N file. Now, since you are all developers, I don't think I need to walk through all of these as in depth as I have
One slide. I just want to check it. Oh, okay.
as I have had to in the past. However, if you do have questions about it, please let me know. We also have a lot to cover, and so here's, for example, a very simple way in which L20N can actually provide different translations according to a countdown, right? So this is what it looks like in the JavaScript. Here's a macro that would be implemented within L20N to define the actual countdown and what translation could be used for that, or what source string could be used for that. And then also within the L20N code, that would be the actual string that would be there for translation, right? You'd see this, the progress is the actual entity ID, and those strings, 0, almost done, 1, would all be what's translated. Now, some languages, this is one of the vast benefits of L20N. I was talking about this exact example to a translation and localization class at BYU. And somebody raised their hand and said, well, I speak Chinese, and we don't have singular or plural. That just doesn't exist for us. So what did we do? And I said, that's a great question. So how does this now change? If you don't have singular or plural, how does this change now? And it took them a little bit, but then they finally realized, oh, that means this now goes away. That's all it is. And in doing so, they're actually able to accommodate their own language requirements. Interesting, right? The many would go away. The one could be replaced with a different attribute in its title, and the string for their particular language might even just leave out the number. It was a very interesting exercise to go through. So here's another example dealing with brand names, right? So how many of you are familiar with the fact that Firefox updates quite regularly? So in an English L20N file, this is essentially what that string would look like when asking or saying that the product has updated, right? We also have a separate channel of distribution called Aurora, which is essentially an alpha testing channel for Firefox. That's what it would look like if Firefox was replaced with Aurora. So if we wanted to go through in Polish and actually assign gender to Firefox, as well as to Aurora, that's essentially what that would look like. We're defining that Firefox is the male version or is male, and that Aurora is female in this sense. And so then when we put it into an actual little bit of a macro, little script in L20N, by assigning that value, it can actually process and provide Firefox in the male column, or in the male part, and Aurora in the female part. And then this just walks through explaining what I just explained. The same goes, we have another string called about product name, about brand name. And the same rule basically applies. Going back to the beginning, we talked about state of being with Polish, that locative form, right? So if we wanted to be able to provide that locative translation, it would really simply be a matter of assigning that locative attribute to the brand name variable, defining those for both, and then when the string is actually pulled through, it would actually only focus on the locative form instead of the nominative form. Yes?
Is Mozilla currently using these on their sites?
Yes.
So it's like in production?
It is in production. It's the main thing that we've been trying to get it into first is Firefox OS, in fact. Another one of the advantages that the sides don't actually show is that in contrast to other localization frameworks for websites and apps and things like that, L20N actually processes at a much quicker speed. And so you get a lot more speed out of implementing L20N as your localization framework than other potential frameworks. So we had started by using a framework called WebL10N, and we're in Firefox OS, and we're gradually migrating from WebL10N to L20N. Eventually, L20N will be placed in Firefox for Android, and then finally arrive at Firefox itself. But there are also several websites that are using L20N currently. The idea is that, we can handle all of these unique elements within language, and we can handle them in isolation and allow those who are expert in those languages to actually determine how they would be processed. The slogan we've got is easy things are easy, complex things are possible, mostly because we want to draw attention to the fact that not every string will require this amount of dedicated coding. We recognize that it's probably only about 5 to 10% of all strings in a target language that would need this. But it's good to have it in place so that those 5 to 10% of strings can actually be translated in a fully expressive and natural way. Any questions about L20N?
So does L20N account for variations within the language? For example, British English is different from American English in some words.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, French Canadian is kind of different from what they speak in France. So do you distinguish that here?
So the challenge with that is that you're actually dealing with different locales. And so when defining an L20N file, you'd have to assign some sort of locale code to that file, because that's how the actual code base will recognize which resource files to pull in. And the difference with Great British English or Indian English or French Canadian versus European Canadian, or European French, European Canadian, is they're entirely different locale codes. And so you would actually have to have separate files that contain separate rules for processing each language.
It kind of would be nice if there was a little bit of object orientation there where you could have some descendants a little bit for locales. I mean,
So some sort of like fallback.
Because,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
but, obviously, I'm not to, not to like tell people, but just as feedback. So, if I have these gigantic freaking L20N files, and one for French Canadian, and one for standard French.
Mm-hmm.
It would be really nice if I could just have one file, and then like the 1% of things that are different have descended files. So this is my master French file.
Yeah.
This is like the tiny differences. Just,
Yeah.
for-
So fallback has been one thing that we have been significantly spending a lot of time on, because we've heard that same feedback before. Unfortunately, fallback, a robust system of language fallback, wasn't implemented in the 1.0 release of L20N, mostly because our target was providing a proof of concept. Like we have to get it into Firefox OS and into other websites in order to actually show that it's valid and it works. We've been able to do that with several Mozilla websites, as well as a bunch of apps and websites outside of Mozilla. And so once we can get L20N into Firefox OS and return to active development for L20N, language fallback will be a very high priority.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. At the end of this presentation as well, there will be a link to the L10N Tools news group. And if you want to provide that feedback or even follow the discussion about language feedback, you can subscribe to that mailing list and learn more about where that discussion is headed.
Awesome.
Any other questions? Okay. So let's move on to Pontoon. So what do shampoo and localization have in common? I know this is not a joke. How many of you are familiar with the fact that the shampoo labels don't say this anymore? I purposely looked. But back in the day, shampoo labels actually would have as the instructions to rinse, lather, and repeat, right? Kind of, there was always that joke where somebody could actually go through a whole bottle within one shower because they just kept repeating, right? So that's very similar to the actual localization process in a way, right? So I mean, with shampoo, we see rinse, lather, repeat. The localization version of that actually involves one little extra step. We extract strings. We localize those strings, right, in some sort of translation tool or text editor, VI, something. We reintegrate those strings back into the builds, test, and if there's a problem, we do it all over again, right? Re-extract, retranslate, reintegrate. And we do all of that until we feel like the strings don't encounter any truncation errors. All of the actual translations, the meaning of those translations fit within the context in which the strings appear. There are no character encoding issues, right? So there are some problems to this approach. Clearly, there is no context. Translators are translating strings in isolation. They have no idea where these strings are going to actually appear in the final product. There are UI issues. You encounter string truncation. You encounter concatenation issues. It's super time consuming because you're constantly repeating these steps and having to interact with multiple people in order to make sure that these first two issues are resolved. Localizers, to a small extent, have to be exposed to some code. They have to know what a variable is, right? At the very least. They have to know what an entity ID is, at the very least. And unfortunately, it inhibits some tight team collaboration and causes tool fragmentation. And when I say tool fragmentation, I mean translators then have to hop from tool to tool to tool to actually see their strings in context, right? They have to hop between browsers, between translation tool, between reference material, between builds. It's difficult. So Pontoon hopes to fix this. Let me give you a small demo. Oh, shoot. Are you kidding me? It's because my internet kicked me off. Boy, how anticlimactic was that, right? Okay. For real this time. So here's Pontoon. Here's the opening page to Pontoon. So this is just a test site that we have up in order to demo Pontoon. You'll see that there's a progress bar up here, which is pretty standard. You can change languages here. You can change different pages within the website. You can also, if you have multiple projects, you can switch between projects. You can also, just like a typical translation tool, see all of the strings, right, that you're going to translate, open them up in isolation, enter a translation. You can see your translation memory right here. You can see machine translation output if you want to just post-edit the machine translation. You can also get a sense of what other locales may have done. So if you're translating into Mexican Spanish, you may be curious what your Spanish counterparts put, right? You also may be curious in order to make sure that you do not translate it that very same way. But the real cool thing about Pontoon is the fact that you can hover over text elements and translate them right here. The UI then becomes responsive. You see how much space your translation is actually going to occupy in the user interface. You're not exposed to entity IDs, or your translators aren't exposed to entity IDs. They're not exposed to variables or to hotkeys or things like that. And it allows them to do what they do best and actually, in real time, see how their translation impacts the site that they're attempting to translate. Now, the really cool thing is that Pontoon does not only work with websites. It works with web apps. So if you have, even if you are coding a web app, which you will later use to wrap into native Java and sell on the Android market, you can still use Pontoon. You can host that app, use Pontoon to have it localized, and that still cuts out so much of the localization shampoo process because you're still allowing your translators to see the context in which they're translating strings and translate them right then and there. Pontoon also allows for real-time collaboration, and so I don't have to be the only one that's doing this. I can have 2 other people online at the same time helping me out with translation. And just like you might see on Google Docs where you see someone else's cursor, it's essentially the same thing in Pontoon. You see other people's cursors, so you're not translating over someone else. Super handy. Another cool thing is that you can actually define scope of your project up in here in the corner. And then finally, you can export. You can either export the translations as an HTML file or a JSON file, or if you have an SVN repository or a GitHub repository where you would like to collect all of these translations, you can commit directly to SVN or GitHub. I personally would love to see Pontoon become the tool of localization of the web. My goal is to one day see Pontoon implemented as a developer tool in Firefox, or at the very least shipped as an add-on to Firefox, in order to allow anyone, anywhere, to translate any website that they might come across, and then export their translations and email them to whatever site admin is listed on that website. Essentially, fully and completely crowdsourcing translation of the web. Any questions or thoughts or jokes or fears or?
So I looked at this a while ago, and I just didn't understand how to set this up exactly. Like if we had a site, how do I is there some kind of integration Pontoon with the site, or like how does that work exactly? It wasn't really
Let's see.
documentation.
Where is that documentation? I wrote it. If you give me your card or something, I can email you the documentation. There is documentation on our Mozilla Developer Network wiki.
Yeah.
There's one about using Pontoon and then one about implementing Pontoon onto your site.
Is it like you set up like a separate server, like a separate application that is Pontoon?
So you could do that, or you could actually just tap into the Mozilla server, the Mozilla Pontoon server. Any other questions? Okay, cool. Then we'll jump ahead with Intellego. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a super awesome demo to give you for Intellego, simply because Intellego was just barely conceived about 3 or 4 months ago. This is our mission as part of Intellego. It's very much a blanket statement mission. But to be completely honest, that is really our goal. It's to be able to provide users with automated translation, encompassing any and all language, any and all content type, on anywhere where they're accessing the web. So there's some problems with the current ecosystem surrounding machine translation. A lot of them, if not all, are very closed. There are a few open source machine translation engines, but unfortunately, they cannot seem to reach global end users like Microsoft Translator can, or like Google Translate can. And so that limits their ability to actually grow and progress. The way that these closed ecosystems actually collect their corpus data as well is completely proprietary and unknown. Really, all they say is web crawling. But what does that mean? And who's to say that that website actually gave you the right to be able to crawl their page and take their translations, which they most likely paid for? So a lot of that's in the dark. Not only that, but so many projects like Google Translate really rely on one single machine translation method and believe that that can encompass all language pairs and all content types. Research has actually shown that that's completely false. And so we can't expect a statistics-based machine translation engine like Google Translate to actually be able to provide accurate output for every language. So this is what we hope to provide as part of Intellego. Intellego aims to be a machine translation marketplace, a platform where you as a user come to select a machine translation engine that you actually want to use, that you believe is going to give you the right output for your translation needs. We are speaking with multiple open source projects right now to talk to them about helping to contribute to the Intellego project and plug into the Intellego platform. Essentially, a user will come into the platform with a particular text that they want to have translated from one language to another, and initially, they will actually have the ability to select from a marketplace of open machine translation engines which engine to actually translate their content through. And in fact, we at some point will be able to even provide a sequential translation output process where you actually select and order engines and pass your content through multiple engines at once. In the future, we will allow, based on machine learning and some statistics, we'll actually be able to intelligently determine which engine is the most appropriate for the end user depending on their source and target language. So then we are nailing down which ones are providing the best output. In doing this, we'll be able to bring open source machine translation fully and completely to the web. At some point, Intellego will be plugged into Firefox. And just as Chrome will pop up and say, and when you visited a page that's not in your language, and say, do you want to translate this? We'll also have that same pop-up. And it will be powered by Intellego. yeah, I explained the intelligent processing for best translation output. So we need help with all of these projects. We want to see them all be successful because we think that they bring a lot to the multilingualism of the web. Right now, I think I saw a statistic that about 55% of the web is in English only. English is also spoken by 5.1% of the world. There's a serious need for more multilingualism on the web. And we really fully feel like these projects can help bring that missing piece to the web. So, here you can find where the Pontoon code repository is. It's hosted on GitHub. L20N is also hosted on GitHub. We have a specific mailing list about localization tools where we discuss Intellego and L20N and Pontoon, as well as several other less prominent localization tool projects. And then if you want to learn more about the Pontoon code repo and L20N code repo contain some documentation about each of those projects. We don't have a code repo yet for Intellego, so the project wiki page is probably the best place to go in order to find more information about Intellego and IRC channels, as well as weekly meetings and stuff like that.
Do you guys have any sort of goal date to have something at least test drivable or something viewable for Intellego?
By the end of the summer, we should have something. We submitted a piece of Intellego to the Google Summer of Code project, and there was a student in the UK that applied to be to take that part of the project on himself. And by the end of the summer, that piece, at the very least, should be up and running. I have been working on process models as well as wireframes and architecture pieces in order to present to the Language Resource Evaluation Conference, Language Resource European Conference. I don't remember what the E stands for. At the end of this month, where a lot of open machine translation projects will be. We hope that by the end of the year, we'll have at least 5 that are actively helping us to develop out Intellego.
Gotcha.
So by the end of the year, it may not be what is actually providing the translations for Firefox, but it will at least be web hosted, and people can go in and will be able to use it.
Okay.
This L20N code, is that a library which Firefox exposes? How would I use it? We have a web application which runs on Firefox, Chrome and stuff like that, basically, and we do a lot of translations too. How would I use this L20N there?
You would use L20N by, let me show you this other resource. If it will come up. Anyway, L20N.org is a very good resource for learning how to implement L20N into your own site.
Okay.
It walks you through the full syntax of the language, and then it also walks you through specific implementation. It directs you to documentation on our Mozilla Developer Network, wiki documentation, and the news group is always a place where you can go to ask questions about any problems you may or may not run into.
Are there other websites besides Mozilla who have implemented this?
Yes. The one specifically that comes to mind right now is the Polish National Library. Their whole site, as well as the actual catalog for searching and stuff like that, is using L20N as their main localization framework. Why is this not working? Did I get kicked off again?
Mine
No.
actually just went down too.
Okay, so it's not me. There we go. So here is where you can actually download it. You can You see there's learn, and that actually walks you through about 20 different chapters that outline the syntax and some exercises. It's actually pretty cool. You've got the actual lesson on the left. You've got where you write your code on the right. And you can see it rendered on the bottom. You walk through various chapters, learning about how L20N handles different challenges. Implement will walk you through how to actually implement L20N. Tinker, once you've learned the concepts of L20N and you actually want to be able to write brief L20N macros and make sure that they are valid and will work and not spit out errors, you can use this Tinker area, the sandbox area, to actually test out your macros and things before you actually make them live in your site. You can fork it, you can discuss it, and that's to the IRC channel, where L20N is discussed regularly. Any other questions? Yeah.
So when you're showing macros,
Mm-hmm.
in the JavaScript version, if a variable changes, does it automatically re-render that text that's using that variable? Or?
That's a good question. I don't know.
When you're showing that demo just now, that's what it did. But is that L20N doing that, or is that something else?
The demo?
I'm curious, yeah. Well, when you
In the slides, or? Oh, when I went to learn.
You were changing.
When I was changing the value?
Yeah. Is that just something that L20N does?
Well,
When the values change, or?
Well, I think that's because
No,
it's
it's-
until it's bound that way.
yeah. That's just the, so this is just rendering whatever you find in here.
Right.
And it's supposed to visually identify what is the difference between like a variable or an entity or a value. And since I'm editing a value, it's adjusting up there, just like if I were to change the entity name, it would do the same. So it's really just, like, I think it's Grease Monkey that allows you to do the same thing. See code and then rendered code.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think that this utilizes some of Grease Monkey to show that. Cool. Well, I highly encourage you all to get involved. If you're interested in languages and localization, Mozilla is really a great place to get involved in. Because like I said, our only limitation is the number of people interested in making the web more multilingual. And so if you're interested, please help us out. Thank you.
Thanks.